All right, so we're going to talk about dynamic scoping now. And what you see here is a snapshot of the procedure that we started our discussion of static scoping on. And so the code's still here, and you've got it in your notes as well. And I want to refer to it when I talk about dynamic scoping. So I've drawn the scope tree here to the right of the procedure, and I reproduce the scope tree just so I can show you the below, so I can show you the call graph. So big can call sub 1, or it can call sub 2. Sub 1 can call itself, sub 2 can call itself, and big also can call itself. And let's say that sub 2 can also call sub 1. All right. So what I want to do with all this information is talk a little bit about how the dynamic scoping works. So here's the scope tree, but the scope tree applies to static scoping, not dynamic scoping. So we're going to get rid of that. Goodbye, scope tree. Thanks for your help. So long. All right. And so in order to determine where x comes from, what we do is we look at the history of the calls that led up to the current reference that we're making to x. So let me give you an example. So here's scenario 1 for dynamic scoping. Big calls sub 1. All right, so the code in Big's main block of code calls sub 1. So where is the value of x, or the variable x that sub 1 is referring to? Now you might just say, oh, well, that's easy, Bob. You know, here's the x in sub 1, and if I use the scope tree, here's the x that was declared in Big, so sub 1 is referring to the x in Big. And I say, yeah, okay, fine. But what about this scenario? Big calls sub 2, which then calls sub 1. So here x is Big, is from Big. All right, in this scenario, in the second scenario, scenario 2, Big is calling sub 2, and then sub 2 is calling sub 1. All right? So what x is being referred to here? Well, the x that's referring to here is the x in sub 2. So even though you might look at this code and say, well, why aren't I using the scope tree? And I'm saying, well, we're not using static scoping anymore. We're using dynamic scoping. And so we have to follow, basically we have to do backtracking, looking at if x is not defined in sub 1, we have to look at the next subprogram that was called, the subprogram that called sub 1, and look to see if x is defined there. And if it's defined there, then that's the x that sub 1 is referring to. So you might be saying to yourself, my God, who could possibly, what languages could possibly use dynamic scoping? And it turns out that, let me get down to the bottom here, There are languages that use dynamic scoping. Those are APL, Snowball, early versions of Lisp, and actually Perl, which you're messing around with. Perl can use dynamic scoping, but it's not default. There's some stuff that you have to do to trigger that dynamic scoping. So that's kind of interesting. Dynamic scoping isn't very popular because it has a number of drawbacks. All right, so it violates the idea of information hiding. Because local variables in one subprogram are visible to local variables of any subprogram that are called subprogram. So it violates information hiding. You can't type check. At compile time. Because you don't know what the type of a variable is going to be until you get the runtime call graph. And it can make debugging challenging as well. And there's also a performance hit because you're doing runtime type checking, obviously, and also you're constantly trying to figure out, trying to locate variables, and you have to do that at runtime. There's no way to pre-wire the location of variables within the location of the access that you're going to need to get to variables. You can't pre-wire that at compile time. You're going to have to constantly determine that information at runtime. Okay. Is there anything else that I want to say here? Well, let's talk about the idea of something called referencing environment. When we talk about scoping, we can also talk about the referencing environment. And so what that means is that it's the collection of all variable names visible to a statement. So for static scoping, what we're talking about here are local variables within the block of code that you're working with, and then non-locals visible via scope tree. And we're actually going to spend some time examining the mechanism that lets scope trees work, but we're not going to do that right now. However, I do want you to be familiar with the idea of referencing environments and how they work. And so I've got some examples here. Let me hit escape. And I want to bring this up. Let's go to 100%. And okay. So over here on the right hand side, we see another example of some ADA code. It says procedure example A is, B is an integer. So we've got a declaration of sub1 and sub2 and sub3. And then I've got these arrows, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what I want you to do is I want you to fill in, let me make this just a little bit bigger, 125, good. What I want you to do is I want you to fill in at point 1, what are all of the variables that are accessible to the lines of code at location 1 here in the program. And not only that, but I also want to know, if you're talking about a particular variable, what subroutine is associated with that variable. All right? Same thing for 2, 3, and 4. So this would be a good place to pause the video and for you to fill this in. All right? So pause the video because I'm going to spill the beans. All right, I am now spilling the beans. So we've got X and Y from sub1, and we've got A and B from example. So those are visible. All right, at point 2, we've got X from sub3, and the X from sub2 is hidden because the X from sub3 overrides it. And then we've got A and B from example. We've got X from at point 3. We've got X from sub2. And A and B from example. And finally, we've at position 4, we've got A and B from example. Awesome. All right, well that takes care of referencing environments. Let's see if there's anything else I want to talk to you about. Yeah, I'm going to stop this and then I'll do a little thing about strong versus weak typing.